I'm going to just start with the Oxford English Dictionary definition of the word vernacular. So in noun form, usually the vernacular, we speak of the language or dialect spoken by people in a particular country or region. So already that first layer of the definition of the word vernacular is quite loaded with that phrase language or dialect, which is already a distinction that's been challenged by a number of people. One of my favorite quips is, a dialect is a language without an army and a navy. So the dialect or language the language or dialect spoken by people in a particular country or region. So also an emphasis on orality as opposed to a written language, and then also on a language that is very situated, and in this case, situated geographically. Then informal with adjective or noun modifier, the terminology used by people belonging to a specific group. So this is the two are related, but it's a slightly different emphasis. Here, the emphasis is on a group of people as opposed to a place. Then in its adjectival form, when we speak of a language that is vernacular, we think of this language as one that is spoken as one's mother tongue, not learned or imposed as a second language. And I think that verb imposed is, again, quite a loaded verb. And one of the interesting implications of the vernacular is it can have political implications, in particular implications of domination and diglossia. Diglossia when in one culture or one place, two or more languages coexist, but they don't all have the same status or prestige. Then of speech or written words using the mother tongue of a country or region, so same thing. And then finally, I also noted the origin of the word because I thought it was interesting that this word comes from the Latin vernaculus, domestic, native. So again, something that is rooted in a place, but also something that is intimate. And then I also was interested in seeing that it came from verna, home-born slave. So again, that's the kind of political kind of implication of vernacular is there already in the etymology of the word. So now I titled this slide Language, Orality, Identity, and Politics, because these are all the big issues that I think are at stake in a vernacular language. So if you're reading a text and there is something that corresponds, some language, some bits of parts that corresponds to some of the definitions that we've already seen, you're going to ask yourself, is this a national or regional language? Is this the language of a particular group? Or is this simply an attempt to reproduce the sounds and rhythms of speech? And obviously all of these things are interrelated. And the reason why I think all of these questions are important is because ultimately, as a translator, you want to know what is going on. And one of the things that will interest you is to ask yourself, what is the vernacular doing in the text? Is it there to validate the power dynamics of diglossia? Or is it on the contrary, is it there for the author or the narrator or a character to lay claim to an identity? So these are two very different things. In fact, they're radically at odds with each other, and they demand radically different types of strategies. So to what extent can a vernacular language be translated? So obviously no language is perfectly translatable. However, as translators, we have to give it a shot. First, the entire text is written in a national or regional language. That's the easiest scenario. You might just say that you translated this book from the Scots or the Gaelic or the Occitan or the Catalan, and you don't really have to necessarily address much more than that if it's a national or regional language. But let us say that the text transcribes the rhythms of speech or is only partly in a vernacular language, and that therefore two different types of language coexist in the text. So if you only have the odd word in the case of a national or regional language, what are you going to do? Well, you could leave it in the original language, especially if it's common enough, or you could add a footnote that is not very popular with publishers, or you could keep it and maybe paraphrase it the first time and then use it again. If the passage is longer, it's more complex. So let us say that you have a regional vernacular language or a national vernacular language that coexists with another language. Let's say, for example, you have Scots English coexisting with English English. How are you going to translate this as a French translator? Are you going to substitute one regional vernacular language for another? For example, are you going to translate this text into the sort of mainstream French of France, the kind of global language that is French, and juxtapose it with passages in Occitan? Well, you could, but it would be problematic because each language carries a number of cultural associations, and those of the south of France and those of Scotland don't really match up. Another strategy is to substitute one type of vernacular language for another. So, for example, you might decide that you are going to substitute the Scots passages in Scots English, you're going to substitute them for, let's say, a more spoken French or even slang. That also can be problematic because Scots is a language that has its own literary tradition, that has a certain a fairly high status. And so if you translate the Scots into something more oral, more spoken, or even more slangy, you suddenly give it you kind of impose a diglossia that was not necessarily there in the original, and that is a problem. So lastly, and more challengingly, you might have to try a more creative, poetic approach. And that would entail a number of strategies, and different translators have done different things. I have seen some translators who basically work with the rhythm of the text and the syntax of the text, and who try to sort of somehow recreate some form of musicality. And sometimes some of them will use what I would call a mishmash, kind of lexical mishmash that might be partly regional, but because it's a mishmash, it's not so easily associated as if you were sticking with Occitan. This is, for example, what the translator of Shaggy Bain in French has done, and it worked quite well. It was well received. So diglossia, how not to be complicit. So here I'm going to speak about Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, a text published in 1936 that was problematic already when it came out, and that has only grown more problematic with time. So here we have a line in English, which I will not read. And it's a slave speaking to the man who just bought her to express gratitude for having bought her child as well. So it's a little bit, it's sort of a little bit difficult, I suppose, to read now, especially that we know that this character in the text is made, has to feel, feels good about himself. He's done a good deed. Anyway, this text was translated first in 1938 by somebody called Jean-François Caillé, and that is still the translation being sold by Gallimard. And in his translation, what Caillé did is that he recreated a French that was really the French of quote unquote, the colonies. So it's a colonial translation. When he uses the word missier, or when he uses the word tiste, obliterating the letter R, what he is doing is he's giving in to stereotypes that are racist stereotypes that were current or common or still existed, or still actually pretty powerful in France in the 1930s. The publisher Gallmeister decided a couple of years ago to have this text retranslated and asked another translator, Josette Chiche-Portiche, to translate it. And so she again struggled with this same problem. But obviously in 2019, when she was doing this, she was aware of the problems. And so what she did is she decided to use a language that was more rural rather than racially connotated. So in that sense, her translation was fairly successful. However, her translation was not, was very controversial and was not entirely well received because nevertheless, she still reproduces overall the racist worldview of the text because she couldn't really help doing it. And it was suggested, for example, that she could have introduced a translator's note or something to sort of create, to make it clear that she had tried to put herself at some distance from her text. And that is the difficulty when you're a translator, because you're not really the author and yet you are the author. So you are responsible for every word on that page. But translation can also be a way of inscribing identity. And so since yesterday we looked at Harry Josephine Giles, I decided to look at some of the texts by this writer. And so here we have quite a nice little 14th of February poem, very elliptic poem, and that is very situated. Festival Square, Lothian Road. We know where this is. This is Edinburgh. There is another sort of little kind of pointer that this is something that is very situated. They are drinking microbrew stout, sorry. They are not drinking a globalized mass market beer, but microbrew. Okay, so here we have these two characters. Again, I would rather not have to read this because all of this is largely about having to, it plays on the contrast between the Scots English and English English. So one character says it's cold, and we have this C-A-U-L-D transcription that sort of really brings to life the accent as much as the language. And then, what did you expect? Again, same thing. And then the contrast with I love you in plain English. So obviously what this writer is doing here is they are playing on that contrast. So as a translator, you're going to have to find a way to do that. And I suppose possibly one way you could do it is you could try to use a slightly phonetic rendition of French. You could try that. That would be one strategy. But however, I want to, again, this is also something by Harry Josephine Giles that we all came across in the lecture on Giles. It's Giles' game called Rake, which is a game that is rather perverse. It's a game partly based on mistranslations, where you have a text written in Scots and a text written in English. And when you press the red button in the game, this sends you across to the translation, except the translation is not really a translation. That would be very difficult to translate. Since the Scots is all about mood and is all about anxiety, is all about states of emotion and feeling, whereas the English is this much more external kind of cliched narrative, of fantasy narrative. And obviously there is something quite important going on, but that would be very difficult to translate. And I will leave you to ponder what you might do.